Welcome everybody. I'm going to just start now. We've got quite a few people have joined us already. Welcome. We're very happy to have you with us at the Japanese Paper Place for our Print Day in May presentation. We're really delighted. My name is Paula. I'm an account representative here at the Japanese Paper Place. I'll be the moderator today. Before we begin, there are a couple small Zoom-related items to bring to your attention. First of all, we have enabled live transcription. If anyone wants to take advantage of having closed captioning, you just click on the CC button at the bottom of your screen. And we just also advise that you be aware that the automatic transcription tends to be kind of creative when it comes to independent, not independent names, but non-English names and Japanese words. So bear that in mind. We do have the chat enabled. Anybody who has a question, please enter it in chat, and I will periodically interrupt our presenter, and we'll ask those questions. And there'll also be a question and answer period at the end of the presentation. We will be recording today's event, and it will be made available at a future date. We encourage you to please follow us on social media, and you'll see the announcement there. I'm just going to admit people as I see them entering the waiting room. If you've just entered, we just ask everyone to please turn their cameras off so it won't be distracting to others during the presentation. Before I go on to introduce our speaker, I'd like to tell you a little bit about the Japanese Paper Place. It all started in the 1970s. Nancy Jacobi was teaching in Japan, and she found herself surrounded by beautiful paper, the likes of which she had never seen. She was inspired by this paper and just knew that if she could get it into the hands of artists in her home city of Toronto, that they could do wonderful things. And that's how it began. Nancy selling, sometimes sheet by sheet, to artist and bookbinder friends. And little by little, under Nancy's guidance, the Japanese Paper Place began and grew. And we can flash forward to 2021. And Nancy's passion for the paper, her love for the paper makers, and her vision of how the use of this exceptional paper could elevate the work of artists in the West has brought us all together and brought the company to where it is today. The Japanese Paper Place is an international wholesale distributor of Japanese paper and is a highly regarded source of information about all things washi in all its iterations and uses. One of the main sources of that knowledge comes from our presenter. Today, I'd like to introduce you to, and I'm very pleased to introduce you to, my colleague, Sigrid Blohm. Sigrid is a longtime employee of the Japanese Paper Place, and she's also an exceptional artist in her own right who uses Japanese paper regularly in her work. I would now invite you to, well, we're going to imagine welcoming applause, and I'm going to turn the screen over to Sigrid, and she'll begin her presentation. Thank you very much. Sigrid, over to you.
Thank you, Paula. It's really, really wonderful to be here and talk to everybody. I'd like to wish everybody, first of all, a happy May Day. It's the 1st of May, and in many places around the world, it is what they call their Labor Day. And I'm sending you greetings from Toronto, where we are in our our third lockdown. So it's a good day to be inside talking about Japanese paper. And what I'm going to do today is, I don't want to give you prescribed types of papers that you can use for this or that kind of printing. What I'd like to do is give you the information that you need to have in order to make your own choices of the selections that are available to you, whether it's through your local reseller, online, or through us directly, although mostly we love you to go to your resellers. So without further ado, I'm going to talk to you about, first of all, why choose washi in the first place. Washi is beautiful. It just is beautiful. I fell in love with it many, many years ago. I've been working for the Japanese paper place for almost 30 years. I think it's 28 or 29 at this point, almost 30 years. And I work almost exclusively with it. And it's because I love the paper and I love finding ways to make it work for me. Washi, first of all, I'll give you a little definition here because some of you will know and many of you will not, that wa is the word for Japan and shi is one of the words for paper. And it has, over the years, we've used this term to refer specifically to the plain papers that you would use for printmaking and for drawing, but it is also known by very many people just as Japanese paper. So in order to refine how we refer to the paper, we've started using the term Heritage Washi, and this is a term that was coined by Jacobi as something that denotes the most traditional types of paper that are made with exclusively Japanese fiber and made in the traditional manner using gentle alkali to cook the fiber and produced by hand. So everything that we're talking about today is in fact going to be pretty much about Heritage Washi, but there are many, many kinds out there available to you. So the first way that you're going to learn how to make those choices is to know that there's a huge variety. So as you can see behind me here, there's an array of plain papers and an array of decorative papers, many, many different ones that you can use. We have everything from tiny little sheets, which are business card sized, to these lovely little square, oguni square sheets of Causal paper, to long, narrow sheets of paper. This is Fukunishi Uragami. In Japan, it's actually expressly used for the middle layer of scrolls. It happens to be one of my favorite papers, and I actually hope you can kind of hear the sound of it, because for me, that's half the pleasure of using the paper. We also have a variety of papers that are made from different fibers. This is Gampi. This is a very coveted type of paper, Yamagampi. Listen to that crispness, and I hope you can see some of the sheen of that sheet of paper there. Then we also have plain, good quality, or top quality, in fact, sheets of Causal paper like this one, which are fairly lightweight but are remarkably strong. So that is just to give you a sense of some of the different formats and the sound of the paper and how it handles. There are so many other kinds that we have here, and it's hard to choose. So in order to know that, I would like to show you just how the papers are made. I'm going to share my screen now, so this is going to take just a moment. Bear with me. And okay, so here you see a wide variety of papers, from the very plain white and off-white ones to some solid color papers to papers on the bottom there that have fiber in them. That's just the tip of the iceberg. Your resellers will be able to choose from everything that we have here and extend that to you. So in Japan, the three main fiber types that are used for making paper are Causal, which is the most common one. It's a long fiber, translucent, strong when it's thin, and strong even when it's wet. The second most common type, although it's becoming rarer to get and more expensive to get, is Gampi fiber. And it forms a very smooth, crisp kind of paper, which is very coveted, I think, for a lot of printmakers to use in Shinkolai in particular. The plant grows wild and it can't be cultivated, which is one of the reasons why it's becoming more and more difficult to procure. The third most common paper fiber would be Mitsumada, which has a warm kind of pinky tone, and it's a soft and supple fiber and very absorbent. Historically, it was used in the making of banknotes, which is interesting because it grows as a shrub, and instead of branching into two the way Causal and Gampi do, it branches into three. And the thought was if they used that fiber in their money would actually increase exponentially threefold as opposed to twofold. So let's go now to Japan to see a little bit about where the paper is made. So this photograph here is taken on the island of Shikoku. And as you can see, it's very rural, and predominantly paper-making centers in Japan were rural. It was farmers who produced the paper. It's not any longer the case. There are paper makers in the cities, but they're very dependent on rural production of fiber in order to make their papers. What you see here, this home in the middle ground here, is the home of the Osakis, who make Seicho-sen Kozo and Seiko-sen Mitsumada papers. Very beautiful, top quality papers. And if any of you have purchased the Heritage Washi pack, there are samples of their paper in here. So that just gives you a sense of where it is that this paper comes from. As with printmaking, paper making is very process oriented, and there's a lot of process that happens before the actual sheet is made, just like there's a lot of process that happens in print before you're pulling your print. So what we're seeing here, most of my images here, I think, are from making paper with Kozo. So what we're seeing here is the pruning of a Kozo plant as it's growing, so that it's not branching out too much. What they're trying to do is produce a plant that has a long stem that will have long fibers without nodes on it. Now, the pruning is just the very beginning of it. They're having to grow the fiber. Here you can see a Kozo field that is ready to harvest. The leaves have fallen off. In the middle ground here, you see the stumps of the plant. And this is what actually makes Japanese paper very special, is that it is a crop fiber. The Kozo, Gampi, and Mitsumada are crops, even Gampi that's wild. And it's grown as a shrub that is harvested. The branches are harvested annually in the case of Kozo, and every 3 to 5 years in the case of Gampi and Mitsumada. And they cut the branches off at the base of the shrub, leaving the rest of the shrub to regenerate new branches over the year. And it's the middle layer and the inner layer of fiber that are used for the paper making. So here we see paper being harvested at by the Yoguni company. This is a very labor intensive process, again, where they're having to cut the branches by hand in order not to damage the rootstock of the plant. So again, lots of labor here. After all of those branches are harvested, they are then cut to size and stacked up into a steamer. So the branches need to be steamed in order to get the bark off of the plant. So different steamers in different places. This is one where they've figured out a way to stack it up very efficiently, cutting all the branches to the same length. And if you can see underneath here, it's actually up on a platform. There's heat underneath here and a cauldron where there's water in it, and the steam rises up into that box, which is sealed off when they're cooking the fiber, and they're steaming the fiber to get at the part that they need. After that is steaming that has happened pretty quickly. They need to strip the fiber off of the branch in order to get rid of the woody center part. So this fellow here, you can see he's pulling off the long fiber, and what you're seeing is the inner white fiber and the stick that's left over. Here's the just steamed branch sitting on the ground. You can see the outer bark, which is what you see when the bush is growing. And then he's got a pile of fiber here that will continue to be processed. So again, it's just every little step of this is very labor intensive. And this is the way paper has been made for over 1400 years. Is the most traditional way. They might use a few modern implements, but this is what's going to make the best paper that stands the test of time. So once that happens, another labor-intensive step is that the outer bark and sometimes the green middle layer needs to be scraped away. This too, in the traditional process for heritage washi, is done by hand. The modern way would be to cook this fiber in a vat with caustic soda. It breaks it down quickly. You don't have to do all that hand scraping, and it's less expensive then to produce. But the best paper they're taking all that excess fiber off by hand so that you're not adding a lot of harsh chemical to it. So once that has been done, the paper fibers will sometimes be soaked out in the water in the sunshine in order to lighten it. So there's two things that are happening here. This is a pool that has been blocked off in the middle of a stream of water, and those I guess you could call them hanks of fiber, have been weighted down and placed out in the water in the sunlight for the water to flow over it and rinse off any little extra bits of bark that are there, and for the sunlight to naturally bleach the fiber. This also happens in mountainous areas where they have a lot of snow. They'll actually lay the fiber out on the snow in order to bleach it through sunlight again. And the snow beating down on the sun beating down on the snow will actually reflect the light back up, and it serves to lighten the fiber. And again, no chemical bleach is involved here. So even before they've got the pulp fiber in order to make the sheets of paper, there's all this work that's gone into it. Here you see a before and after picture. On the right here is fiber that has been bleached. This is from Oguni, which the previous slide where you saw them putting the fiber out in the snow, this is where this would have been bleached, is out in the snow. This stack of fiber has not been bleached. I think there may be a little bit of the green middle layer of bark on there still, but you can see there's quite a contrast in the tone, and that just comes from natural means. So backtracking just a little bit, when I talked earlier about heritage washi being made from Japanese fiber, here I want to give you a sense of what fiber looks like that comes from different regions. Not everyone in Japan will grow their own fiber. I think, in fact, that the majority of paper makers buy fiber from fiber wholesalers. It's just too much work for everybody to do everything. So on the left here, we see Cousal fiber that was grown in Thailand. In the middle, there's a stack of paper fiber, Cousal fiber that's been grown in China. And on the right is Cousal from Japan. I mean, aside from the size of the bundles, you can see that there's a very different quality to the fibers that are in there. The Japanese fiber is the longest, and if you were able to see it close up, you would see it would have the least nodes. And that's because they very carefully tend the growing plants and prune them so that there are not a lot of branches coming off to create little nodes of fiber. Because of all of that labor involved, it's also much more expensive for paper makers to procure this fiber. And because they're paying more money for their fiber, they're also using the Japanese fiber to make their very best papers. There's no point throwing good, expensive kozo into a vat of caustic soda to cook it down. So this is what a lot of paper makers will be working with, is fiber that's dried like this and stored, and then they soak it and cook it whenever they need it. So the next part of the process, so you have this fiber that's been soaked. You need to cook it to break it down, because it's still these long strips of fiber that are very natural and glommed together. And so what this woman here is doing is she's putting large clumps of soaked kozo fiber into a big vat right here. It almost looks like a barrel, but it's a vat that's sunken into a hearth where there's heat in there. And in this vat, she puts the fiber, but there is also a mild alkali put in there in order to help break down the fiber. So the alkali being soda ash or wood ash or lime. Again, the more modern way to make paper more quickly is to use caustic soda. It cooks the fiber faster, but it also has a lasting effect on the fiber. It breaks it down almost too much. Conscientious paper makers will use caustic soda and rinse the fiber really well, and that's still good, and it will outlast us, papers made that way. But these papers, the heritage washi made the traditional way, will outlast our great-grandchildren and then some. I love this photo, actually. It looks a little bit almost medieval to me. If you get rid of the fact that there's a plastic pail here and she's wearing a rubber apron, I think it could be a centuries old kind of image. So the fiber is cooked, And then after that, once again, it goes through a whole other cleaning process called chiritori, where they're going over the fiber that was cooked once again and picking off any little bits of bark that got left there that weren't scraped off before, that weren't bleached out by the sun. And this is all hand process. Traditionally, this would have been done by older people in the community because it was something that was fairly sedentary and they could sit there. But man, oh man, that looks like backbreaking labor to me. And it's also, please note, done in very cold water so that the fiber doesn't spoil. So their hands would get quite cold. So this is in a hand paper making studio. And this is in a studio that makes paper by machine, the Kashiki studio, where they make excellent paper for conservation use. So technically we wouldn't consider them Heritage Washi because they're making their paper by machine, but I think they get an honorable mention because of the way that they process the fiber and the way their machines work. So even here, where they're making great long rolls of 60 meters in length, they're processing their fiber by hand and picking out all of the bits of dross by hand. So again, labor. It's appropriate that we're talking on May Day, Labor Day. Next, the fiber then, in order to be useful to make paper, needs to be beaten down some more. The very old traditional way would be to do this by hand. Very few paper makers do this with a mallet anymore. There's, maybe a handful in Japan who are doing it this way, or perhaps hobbyists. But it's a pound onto the fiber, move the fiber around and pound some more just to break it down. And you can imagine that is very hard on the body. I think even very traditional paper makers are quite happy to resort to more mechanical means, as in this, which is an image from, I believe it's from the village of Kuretani, which is the oldest continuous paper-making village in Japan. They have this mechanical stamper where it mimics the hand pounding, and these great big, I don't know that you could call them mallets, but just big stamps of wood go up and down and process the fiber. The stampers move around and then they shift the fiber around. And yet one other way of beating the fiber, a much more modern process, would be with a beater. I believe this is a Naginata beater, which has blades in it. So if you can see my pointer tool, here we go. The water and fiber go around in a sort of oval here, and inside here are these great big blades that rake through the fiber and cut it to some degree and pull it apart. So that is a more modern method. Next, not just fiber is needed for the making of really good paper. If any of you have made paper before, Western style paper, it's basically a bunch of fiber in a vat with water, and you dip your screen into it. Japanese paper has this other ingredient called a formation aid, something that thickens the water that the fiber is suspended in. The main ingredient for this is something called tororo aoi. It is a type of hibiscus, and this is the root of the plant. So this root is crushed in a big mortar, and it's left to soak in water, and then it's crushed and it exudes a mucilage. I'm sorry I don't have a good photo to show you of that process, but what that mucilage does is it's added to the vat to thicken the water that the fiber is suspended in. And this is quite critical to the whole process of making a good sheet of, an even sheet of washi. So this is Imai-san, who makes a number of the lovely papers that we carry, including Kizuki Tosakozo. So he's just dropping some tororo aoi into that mortar, and he will crush it. So then on to the actual sheet forming process. So like printmaking, you've had all of your processes, getting your plate ready, getting your ink ready, getting your paper all prepped. So all of the fiber has been prepared, the formation aid has been prepared, and now comes time for the sheet forming. Now, I should mention that these photographs of the process of the whole papermaking process are taken in a number of different places because we wanted to try to give you the best information possible. So I've got a number of paper makers that you'll see here. So this one here is this young man is at the paper making vat, and he is stirring the fiber with this kind of a rake, I guess you could call it. So he swishes that back and forth, and that gets the fiber in even suspension in that vat that's there. The next part of the process is that he's got this screen, which is made out of finely woven bamboo mesh, and that's clamped inside a frame here. That bamboo mesh is much like a bamboo mat or a roller blind, but very finely made. He's now dipping the screen into the fiber and the liquid slurry, let's call it, and scooping up some of that fiber, and then swishing it back and forth on the screen. So this is a different place, just because I wanted you to see the action photo of the fiber and the thickened liquid moving back and forth on the screen. I quite love this shot because you do see here, which is water and fiber and the mucilage in it. And the action of the paper maker, taking the screen and manipulating it forwards and backwards, side to side, aligns the fiber in the screen. And the formation aid that's in the vat keeps it nicely in suspension in the vat, but it also slows down the drainage of the water through this screen, giving the paper maker time to manipulate the fibers on the screen to get the most even sheet possible. What's pretty amazing to me here is that these screens, even to make a very thin sheet, are dipped into that vat multiple times for each sheet. And it amazes me that they're not washing off the first layer and the second layer and the third layer of fiber that they've got on there. So that's how the sheets are built up. Here we see another paper maker with a screen where he's finished doing the sort of sloshing and I shouldn't call it sloshing because that doesn't sound very precise, but he's finished forming the sheet, and now he's putting the screen up on a couple of dowels that will hold it up out of the vat, and he will lift that paper. This is another paper maker again, off that flexible screen to transfer the wet sheet onto a post of wet sheets, which will then later get pressed. So this bamboo screen here is taken off of the frame, and it's a flexible screen that allows him to lay down gently that very thin layer of fiber onto a wet stack. What's interesting here, for any of you who have made paper in the Western style, in between each layer of paper, you would normally have what's called a blanket, much like the blankets you would actually use for printmaking on a press. There would normally be a blanket in between each layer, but the Japanese paper making technique is to lay one wet sheet on top of another wet sheet on top of another wet sheet. And they're able to do this in part because of that formation aid that just allows the fibers that are on that wet sheet to coalesce together, and also a little bit of a slippery layer in between so that they can be separated. So here we see a stack of wet papers. I don't know if this is a day's production, half a day's production, but many, many sheets of paper. These will need to then be very slowly pressed to get the excess water out of them. Unfortunately, I don't have a good image of this, but it's a process that happens gradually. You can't just put a board on this and press it out quickly and lift the sheets off and dry them out. You need to very gradually press them, squeeze them. And I've heard of paper makers putting the paper in a press, letting it squeeze, going out to the press, tightening it up a little bit. It's probably an awful lot like a book press or a platen kind of press, just gently pressing out all of the water that's in there. After this, then the paper could be stored until they have time to put it out on boards to dry. Here in Oguni, they actually store their paper outside in the wintertime, natural refrigeration. So it's an old technique where they would dig these little caves in the snow and put the wet stacks of pressed paper out in the snow to keep them from going moldy until such time as they could actually put them out onto the boards to dry. If they don't do that, then they're going to brush the paper onto, traditionally it would have been wooden boards to dry out in the sunshine. Here we see Seicho Senkozo out on boards to dry. And remember that first picture I showed you of the home in near Kochi of the Osakis. This is old Mr. Osaki, who sadly died a few years ago, but his daughter and his granddaughter particularly continue the production of their paper. They make excellent, excellent Kozo papers. And if you've ever had the good fortune to see a sheet of it, you can actually see the slight texture of the wood grain of the boards that it's dried on. Those of you who have purchased a package of the Heritage Washi, there are samples of the Seicho Senkozo and Seiko Mitsumada made by this family, and you can see a wood grain texture on the surface. Many paper makers will do this, but many paper makers will also, actually I should say, many paper makers will dry their paper on wooden boards, but those boards are harder and harder to come by. They need to be particular kind of wood that's not very resinous, so it doesn't leach any sort of resin color onto the paper, and also the boards break down. So paper makers are very careful in handling the boards that they have because new ones are harder and harder to get. The more modern way of drying the paper would be to use a stainless steel dryer that's heated from the back. There's a number of things that are really interesting and amazing to me in this photograph. And first of all, this woman here, she's handling what looks to be a standard size sheet of about 2 by 3 feet or something along those lines. And she's got this, what looks like just crumpled up wet sheet of paper, but it's strong enough to be able to withstand all of it being held in one hand. And then she's using this wide flat brush to take any air bubbles out, sticking it onto, and then when I say sticking, she's not using any paste, it's just the suction of the fiber itself onto this smooth, heated stainless steel surface. What you can see a little bit of here, I hope you can see it, is a little bit of the brush mark here that is being left by her brushing the paper onto there. A lot of the papers, the handmade papers, you can actually see the brush marks on the back of the sheet. That is one of the telltale signs that the paper has been made by hand and not by machine. Two things are happening here then. The surface that's against the stainless steel dryer will take on that smooth surface, and the surface that she's brushing on will be a little bit toothy. And you will see when you start handling, and you may already have noticed, Japanese papers tend to have one smooth side and a slightly rougher side. For a lot of printmaking techniques, the smooth side is considered the correct side to use because you are going to get a lot of nice plate tone or fine detail. There are reasons, of course, to use the toothier side if you wish. Both sides will work. It's important to know that there is a difference between the sides when you're working on any project, so that you can be consistent. If you're producing an edition, you want to have everything either on the smooth side or on the rough side, unless you're doing a varied edition. So that's generally the process there. Many varieties of paper that can get made. And here, this is an image of mostly Mitsumada fiber papers. In fact, they're all Mitsumada fiber papers. The natural pinky tone here of the end sheet and the second sheet, tissue sheet here, are the natural tone of the fiber. This is a white Mitsumada tissue, which unfortunately we can't get anymore. That was Inshu Mitsumada white. That's fiber that has been bleached, and this is Mura Konagaban Mitsumada, and that's just a slightly whiter, lightly, I think, naturally bleached Mitsumada fiber. Now, at this point, I think I'll see whether or not there are any questions. Paula, are there any questions?
Yes, Sigrid, yes. We did have one question, and the question is, how does Coastal fiber paper compare to rice paper especially when doing intaglio? But I think the bigger question maybe you could address is the rice paper question.
Yeah, the rice paper question. Rice paper is a difficult term. It's a term that's been out there for a very long time. It's a term that we prefer not to use because truly there really isn't any rice in the paper itself, and it's a bit of a generic term to us. It doesn't tell us much about what it is. And I've had people come to us asking for rice paper that is, when what they're looking for is paper that's got decorative fiber in it or has some color in it. They're not necessarily looking for the plain stuff. We don't really know where the term came from. It may be that once upon a time, it came from the fact that some paper makers would add rice starch to the surface of their paper to make it smoother and to fill in the pores. So it might have come from that. But it's a term that we sort of shy away from. When people are asking for rice paper, I try to find out what they're looking for, if they're looking for a plain one. But probably most of these papers that I've been talking about, especially Causal, would be what people are thinking of when they think of rice paper. So depends on who's calling it that, whether or not it would be appropriate.
Sigrid, there's another question, or the question is from Reg Beatty, and he says, can you talk about the supports holding the mold as the papermaker forms the sheet? Is it a kind of counterweight?
That's a good question, and if you'll bear with me for a second, I'm going to scroll back here. So you can see a couple of images. This is probably the best one here. This is very backbreaking labor to hold this screen and dip it into the vat of fiber all day long, making multiple sheets. And thank you, Reg, for asking the question, because it's a very good one. These ropes here that are attached to the handles of the screen are actually holding that screen out. They're lifting it up and holding the screen out of the vat of fiber. So the paper maker actually needs to press down in order to scoop up some fiber. But what this means is when they've got a layer of fiber and water to slosh across the screen, that he's not having to support the weight of it. He's basically allowing those ropes to hold the weight and can shift the screen back and forth. Then two, what's here is a solid frame, a non-flexible frame that opens up kind of like a book, and that flexible screen that we saw a little earlier. Whoops. Here, that flexible screen is housed inside that frame. Here we have another, there must be a couple of different vats here that are being used. So here we've got another image of that suspension system. So it is really a suspension system. I don't know if it's counterweights. It's basically ropes attached to the ceiling, I think. So, good question. Any others? Whoops, I'm going too far.
Yes, Sigrid. The question is from Michelle Rose, and she says, if I understand correctly, the fibers used are only those between the bark and the inner branch. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct. There are two layers of fiber in there. So the outer brown bark that you see when the bush is growing and that they are scraping off in that first process after the steaming, it's the layers underneath that. There's a green middle layer, and then there's the inner whiter layer. The whitest, brightest papers use only that white inner layer of bark. Some papers will have some of that green middle layer, and those papers in fact have a little bit more tone to them, and they can be slightly greenish, but that fiber is also fine for making the paper out of, but it's got more tone, so it isn't always included.
And Sigrid, you did mention earlier, sorry to jump back, that if someone has used rice paper, that there's a good chance it was a Causal fiber paper?
Causal fiber paper or a Causal fiber mix. More often than not, it's sold as paper for calligraphy and sometimes as printmaking paper. I've seen a lot of rolls that are called rice paper. More often than not, they come from China, so they're going to be of a very similar type. I mean, we understand that paper making came from China and Korea in the first place, so it's the same kind of technique, just a different naming process. That we choose not to use just because of the confusion it causes.
Okay, I think that looks like all the questions we have about paper making for now.
Okay.
So I will hide myself once again and encourage you to continue.
Okay. So here we've talked about how the paper is made. And so what I wanted you to see with this is that it's a very labor-intensive process, very labor-intensive, and it gives you a sense of why some of the papers might be termed as a bit expensive, but it gives a good reason why they are. So first, a couple of traditional uses of the paper in Japan. Here we see Mr. Kobayashi, who makes some amazing papers using only very traditional techniques. In fact, in the Heritage Washi pack, there is some of his paper is included in there. What I really wanted to show you here are two things. He's holding some of the branches that are used, that come out of the middle of those are kozo branches essentially, and it's the middle part of the that the fiber is peeled off of. It's sometimes saved to use in craft processes, but often the paper makers will keep it, dry it, and use it to burn, to heat up the steamers or to heat up the vats where they're cooking the fiber. The other thing I wanted to show you is his jacket here, which is an indigo dyed jacket made of shifu. Shifu is fabric that is woven from thread that is made out of paper. I think this is actually a phenomenal thing because it illustrates just how strong the papers are and how long the fibers are. So it's a very complicated process that I won't go into in any detail, but essentially sheets of kozo paper primarily are cut into very thin strips. In this case here, I've got a beautiful illustration of thread that is made by Hiroko Karuno, who lives here in Toronto. She cuts the paper into 1 millimeter, 2 millimeter, 5 millimeter wide strips, and then through a long process, she twists those fibers into long thread. So each of these skeins here would have been one sheet of paper, one standard 2x3 foot a sheet of paper. Her most common size to cut the fiber to is 2 millimeters here, as we see in this middle skein. And these are all 2 millimeter wide cuts of paper fiber that or a thread that she has then dyed with some natural dyes. So the fabric that is woven out of that thread is strong, just like linen. And I know that Hiroko, when she does her weaving, will actually wash her cloth in a machine. And there's an early sample here of some of the fabric that she's been making. So that's just to give you an idea of some of the traditional uses of the paper in Japan. Also, for the transmission of light, shoji screens are less and less common in homes just on their own. So now with the advent of glass and curtains, that's much more common, but there's something quite beautiful about light coming through a translucent sheet of kozo in the window. And here we see shoji screens, which are in front of glass, but they're quite insulating too. Another use would be, like us, for paper, for keeping records. These would be old account books. This is from the collection of a paper maker, these sort of antique account books. And what's interesting is this mat on the floor that is made out of repurposed pages from these kozo account books. You can still see the calligraphy that's on them, or the writing that's on them. The paper has been treated with persimmon dye, and possibly even some konnyaku starch. The persimmon dye waterproofs it. So all of these little pieces are pasted together to make what is essentially a floor mat. So the paper has a lot of insulating abilities. I'm showing you this because I think it can give you some amazing ideas of things that can get made out of the paper. So as a printmaker, you can put designs and prints and images on the paper, but there are other things that you can do with it afterwards, should you wish. So now going to artwork. A lot of this stuff is from our collection, but not all of it. And what I wanted to do is give you a sense of what a variety of artists have done with the papers using the different qualities. A lot of printmakers are concerned about Japanese papers being thin, and they are thin, but they are remarkably strong. Some artists have taken that quality and used it to enormous advantage. Now this beautiful print here, and I hate to say it, I don't remember Olga's last name. Olga has taken this relief print and she's printed on both sides of a sheet of paper. The title of the work is I Can't Move Forward. And you get a real sense of the bird's eye view and the bird looking at the knee here and this young woman sort of being back in the shadows and in a fog. This part of the print is printed on the reverse side of the paper. So she's using the thinness of the paper in order to get this lovely sort of shadowy gradation of color without having to print in a different color ink and get that right. There's just something giving it quite a lot of depth by printing on the back side. So she's using the thinness of the paper to great advantage. Another image of work that uses the thinness of this paper is, this is a lino cut and paper bag made by Lisa Levitt. What I love about this is Lisa had done a very large body of work where she was printing on both sides of the sheets of paper, various textures to make it look like cloth. But in this series, she decided to take those prints and turn them into little paper bags because one of her favorite things was going into hardware stores, old-fashioned hardware stores, where, excuse me, you could buy nails and things like that and you get them in a paper bag. So she put her patterns onto the paper and then made bags out of them. What I find fascinating here is that on the thin paper, the ink started taking on a certain body of its own and developing a sheen to it. When I first saw some of these pieces displayed at Open Studio, I thought they were actually out of poured ceramic or porcelain or something like that. They had such a lovely shiny surface to it. It became something quite other. But again, she's printing on something thin and on both sides of it and building up the ink. Maybe not everybody would want that, but I think it's used to great advantage in this lovely little bag here. So here's an image, and I have to apologize for the photograph. It really is not a great photo. It's a print by Rebecca Cowan, who I waved at earlier. I think she's listening, so apologies for the bad photo, Rebecca. But this is an intaglio print where she has mounted the print here on a wooden panel, and in behind here, and this is what I hope you can see, this is part of a nymph series. Rebecca has drawn on the panel behind the print and then pasted the image of the trees on top so that she's got this very ethereal look of this face, this nymph in the trees here in the background. And I believe that this tree here is also either on the panel or printed on the reverse side of the paper. So this is mounted in a shadow box. So again, using the thinness to very, very great effect here. And I love that whole series, just that sort of there but kind of hidden feeling. Another one of Rebecca's works, she makes these beautiful little books because she believes that art should be portable. Why not take little books with you and have them with you to take out when you need an art break sometime? So she's using a very lightweight Cozo to make this accordion fold book. I should say it's this one here in the foreground. The paper is very easily foldable, but strong enough that it withstands being folded into this little book. Also, I should note that this decorative paper on the front called Akebono is pasted on top of the title Summer that is printed on the board that's underneath. So when a paper is pasted on top of something else, you can see layers of imagery underneath it. In the background here is another accordion fold book by Liz Menard, where she's layered a lot of color onto that paper. And again, it withstands quite a lot of layers. And I like this image because the thumb that's holding the book in the background just gives you an idea of the small scale of these portable works. This is by Liz Parkinson, and it's actually mixed media, print and collaged print, layers upon layers pasted on top of one another. And you get a really nice kind of depth happening here because there's colors underneath and softened by another piece of paper being put on top, and that's probably, the gold is probably screen print on the top of everything there, and litho for the bowl, and etc. Using, I'm not quite sure what paper she used, but it would have been a very thin kozo here. So again, using the thinness and not being concerned about it being too thin. This is a beautiful large print, and apologies for it being an image taken that's behind glass, but this is a print by woodcut artist Naokumatsubara. She does some amazing work. She lives here in Oakville, Ontario. Big, bold, colorful works. She has a very large collection of work that is in the Royal Ontario Museum. Big pieces, small pieces, using multiple blocks of color, and the papers can withstand all of that intense amount of ink and intense amount of printing. But what's interesting too is she has done work, and this is an image of Naoko in her own home, where she's got these beautiful woodblock prints of her own that have been pasted onto these sliding doors or fusuma. So print doesn't have to be flat on a wall in a frame. It can be used I wouldn't call it an installation, but it can be used in the home. It can adorn various spaces, and I quite like that is how she's used it here. It's a very beautiful, calm image. Not print works. These lamps were made by Lorraine Pritchard and her husband, Stan Phillips, who run the shop Au Papier Japonais in Montreal. Lorraine is primarily a painter and drawer on washi, and these lights here, and unfortunately the image doesn't do it great justice. What she has done is on these sheets of paper, she has made a whole lot of very calligraphic-like marks, writing-like marks, and then she treated the paper with konnyaku starch and very finely creped them, and then wrapped them around these lamp forms to make these three-dimensional, very sculptural drawing kinds of works. And I can imagine all kinds of imagery on top of those papers, whether it's print or drawing or painting or whatever, and it's still transmitting light. So a very nice way to use the paper. This is a collaborative print. I guess you could call it a print. It's not really a print. It's many different prints by Doug Guilford and Lisette Thibault. A number of years ago, I think it was 10 or 11 years ago, there was a collaboration project between Toronto Print Studio, Open Studio, and Engram, which is in Quebec, where printmakers from each of those studios paired up and created bodies of works collaboratively. What's really amazing about this is that Lisette and Doug used very thin paper, I think it was called usumino, to do their various etchings on. And then those etchings, and I think they're all about 6 to 8 inches square, were sewn together by hand and turned into this large quilt. And as you see it here, they've got it out on a clothesline, blowing in the wind. So very lightweight, yet still strong. And here's another view of it, just to get a sense that they made sort of large numbers of curtains or quilts of these images here. So thin paper, strong enough to withstand being stitched together and blowing in the wind. Another installation here is by Libby Haig, who does a lot of amazing installation works. And she's using the lightweightness and the malleability of the paper, and her installations, she's got all of these different components that she will use over and over again, putting up an installation, taking it down, reusing the components. In the background here, we see these long, skinny printed panels, which are very interesting. You see them here. I think she's using a paper, primarily using a paper called Okawara. What she's done here is she's printed them in white on the cream colored paper, and then she's brushed color onto the paper afterwards, and the white ink acts as a bit of a resist. Very, very nice effect. But these panels were used in the previous image here in a different way. So these components that are very lightweight and portable, and she's using them over and over again for different installations.
Hi, Sigrid.
Yeah.
I'm sorry to interrupt. There's a couple of little things that I think might be pertinent to address now, partly so I don't forget before we get to the very end. One question is it necessary to mount the thin paper onto a thicker paper or board for display purposes? And I think some of these images show that that isn't necessary, but do you have any guidelines or suggestions for people with that concern?
Absolutely, it does not need to be mounted. I think the papers are really quite lovely on their own. It really depends on your comfort level in how you're handling the print work. If you're having print that's going to be framed, you might want to have it in a mat. Most of the stuff in our collection, though, are just loose prints, and they look fine and handle fine. If you've got work that's being shown in a gallery, it really depends on the gallerist's comfort level, whether or not you're actually going to mat them and frame them or put them on a support underneath acetate. Sorry, there's a word for it and it's not coming to me right now. Putting them in some kind of an enclosure. But it is absolutely not necessary. These papers are quite tough and they can take a lot of handling. It just depends on your comfort level. I actually like being able to see the very slight undulations of the surface of the paper and how the light almost reflects, goes into the fiber and reflects through it. And papers are a bit porous that way. So no, it's not necessary. Absolutely not.
And another question, just to confirm, the starch that Lorraine used for those lamps, was it konjaku?
Yes, the starch she used was konjaku. It's a starch that is produced in Japan or probably other places. Actually, primarily we know it in the food industry. You often see ingredients lists saying konjac. It's a starch that comes from a tuberous root called devil's tongue root, and it's kind of like a potato. The starch, it comes as a granular form and it's mixed with water and basically brushed onto paper to give it a certain amount of resistance to surface abrasion, and it fills in the pores a little bit. It would have been used in Japan traditionally to make paper more cloth-like in order to make clothing. In fact, they would make jackets and kimono and other objects out of paper by brushing the konjaku onto it. Artists in the West in particular have found ways of using it to in their sculptural work for making paper tougher and less likely to pill and get fuzzy. So if any of you have ever crumpled up sheets of paper, whether it's Western paper or Japanese paper, you notice that it can get a little bit soft and fluffy with a lot of wear. The konjaku starch on the fiber will toughen it up that way. It also gives it a certain kind of memory, so you can press creases and shapes into it and it holds them quite crisply.
And another question, one more, for the piece that you showed that was many layers, prints and collage. Do you know if the paste that she used was jinshofu or was it a rice paste, or do we have that information?
I don't have that information. I'm sorry, I don't know. I don't know. Anything is going to work, in fact. Jinshofu, being wheat starch paste, or also rice starch paste, are the most traditional ones to be used in Japan, and also probably the least likely to make themselves known as themselves in a piece of work. If you use something like a white glue, a good quality PVA, or something like that, the glue itself has a certain amount of body, where if you're starting to layer it up, you'll get a sense of that glue. It'll have a shine, even if you're using something like a matte medium or something like that. It has a sort of a plasticiness. So for layers of thin papers, you start to get that plasticky feeling. It's going to work. It's going to hold the layers together and it will protect them to a large degree. But you'll have a strong sense of that in the final work. If you're using jinshofu or other starch paste, like the green tube starch paste we have available, they're much more matte and they disappear in the final product unless you've got great gobs, which of course you're not going to do. And they also have the great advantages of being what's called reversible. So if you ever needed to get anything apart again, you could steam it and pull it apart. Conservators.
And so now the question is, nori is the question, the word nori, question mark. Maybe you can say what nori is.
Nori is paste. Jinshofu and wheat starch paste, rice starch paste, the stuff, Yamato paste, Yamato nori. So it's a word that means paste. So jinshofu is a kind of nori.
Okay,
Yeah.
I think that's all the questions for right now.
Okay.
I'm going to disappear again and let you continue. Thank you,
Okay.
Sigrid.
So another piece here that is not a print work, but a really lovely, beautiful installation by Toronto artist Fly Freeman. She makes these amazing sculptures, installations out of pieces of wood and panels of color paper. I could easily see panels with print works in there, all kinds of things that could go into that. A really nice way to make use of the lightness of the paper, because she's not adding weight to this sculpture that she's created here. Just a beautiful thing. Of course, I would be remiss if we didn't talk about Shinkolai. Shinkolai is probably the way most printmakers first learn about using Japanese paper. Shinkolai, meaning literally, it's a French term meaning pasting Chinese paper or Japanese Oriental paper onto another layer of backing paper. This beautiful print here, it's a very small one by Augustine Rolando Rojas. He does some amazing etchings and really beautiful Shinkolai, where he's taking little strips of color paper, the red, the yellow, and the blue, and pasting them. I'm not a print teacher here, so the essential process is when you're printing your plate, at the same time as you're printing your plate, you're adhering these thin layers of Japanese paper onto your backing or Western paper at the same time as you're printing it. So it's adding color without having to print multiple colors or have multiple plates. And you can see you could play around with that quite a lot. Beautiful, beautiful prints by Augustine. And here's another one, and I apologize, the print's got a wrinkle on the bottom. This is one from our collection. That's our fault, kind of got a little crushed in the drawer. Why not print on color? He's doing Shinkolai not onto a Western paper, but onto a red Japanese paper. This would be Moriki Kozo. The paper he's then printing on top of there is a tan colored paper, and even more Shinkolai, and behind there he's got a red tissue, a pink tissue, and a blue tissue. And it all works out really wonderfully. So you can do all kinds of layering with these papers, and they work nicely because they are thin, and when you've got them layered, you're not getting these abrupt sort of cut edges that show in your print. So why not print on color? Another print altogether on a more decorative paper. This is a pochoir or stencil print by Brian Kelly. Brian does all kinds of print, woodcut, intaglio, stencil prints. He paints as well. This particular print, he's used a paper that most printmakers would shy away from, and it's a paper that has unryu fiber. Unryu basically being these little fibers of not so beaten down kozo that are put in the paper for decorative effect, but when you're printing something like a woodcut or an etching, they actually don't give you a very accurate print. You get little sort of halos of non-printing area around that, so it's a bit bumpy. But stencil print, screen print, pochoir, all work quite nicely on a very textured paper. Brian uses these clear acetate stencils so that he can easily register the different shapes that he's got one on top of the other, and he's using dry chalk pastel with a little wool pad to get the color on there. One of the things that he notes, it's often preferable to use the back side of the paper. Most printmakers would use the smooth side. For this kind of pochoir, the toothier back side is much better. It holds the pastel, and he says often the pastel is worked into the fiber well enough on the back side that you don't even need to use a fixative. So very, very creative technique and beautiful, rich results here. And here's another one of his pochoir prints that's done on a very plain kozo paper. So this is just a much more delicate kind of effect. And what I love here is that this background here, that's just the color of the paper, and that color of the paper enlivens the work. I think it adds to it. It's not just a plain flat white. Printmaker Romney David Smith. This is quite a small image. It's about 6 inches across, and a lot of printmakers don't like using a paper that has strong laid lines in it. Laid lines being like a watermark from the screen that the paper is made on. You may not be able to see it that well in this image, but what you can see here on the white edges here is a little bit of the bamboo screen. Actually, this might have been on a reed screen that this paper was made on. Printmakers will shy away from it, thinking it's going to detract from the overall image. But if you look at this detail shot, there's a phenomenal amount of detail, and I don't find and see any of that laid line there as being very distracting. Enormous amount of detail in there. So Causal papers work really well for intaglio. Another kind of print entirely, this is sort of a hybrid. It's an encaustic monoprint by Melt Jewel. He works a little differently than some. He actually paints with encaustic onto a solid panel, sometimes a heavy paper, sometimes masonite, and then he puts the Japanese paper on top and touches it with a hot iron so that he's transferring some of the color that way and has a certain amount of control over it. But what's really wonderful about this technique is he's using Japanese papers because he can see where he needs to touch more with the hot iron. The encaustic is coming right through the paper. Another one here, it's a hybrid kind of print here. This is by Michael Earl, a beautiful sort of Shinkolai after the fact, whereas he did this on the right side, it's a monoprint, and on the left there's a dry point and some screen monoprint down here on a Gampi paper. Michael really loved the fact that the Gampi that he used for the monoprint gave him a huge amount of detail, and it's that smooth surface of Gampi fiber papers that gave him this kind of modulation that he felt he really couldn't get with any other kind of paper. Another print on Gampi. This is by Tara Cooper, and what I find quite amazing here is it's quite a small thing. It's maybe about 4 inches across. This little pillow here. She's got a litho on it on a thin Gampi tissue, which she then sewed into a pouch, turned so that the seams were on the inside, stuffed feathers into it, and then sewed it shut. And it's this thin tissue, but it's withstood lots of handling. We pass this around at various talks that we give when we can be in person. And it's withstood quite a lot of handling, and that thin tissue works quite well here. And it's translucent too. One of the things that, I'm sorry, the photo's not very good, but what you can actually see when you see it in real life is that you can actually see some of the feathers underneath there. You get a sense that it's stuffed with feathers. And one more image.
I'm butting in again.
Yeah.
There's a question about dampening the paper. And I know from my own experience that the different fibers react very differently to being handled while wet. The papers made with the different fibers. Maybe you could address that just briefly.
Sure. Dampening the fibers is something that's generally done, and it's most necessary in a Western paper that has a lot of sizing in it. Most Japanese papers don't have sizing. Sizing is something that's added to the paper to make it a little less absorbent. So a Western paper would almost need to be soaked to take some of that sizing out. Your paper washi can become a little bit more receptive to your ink if you put it in a damp pack, meaning you wouldn't want to soak it directly in water because it almost becomes too floppy, and the paper is already fairly absorbent. But spritz some newsprint, get the newsprint damp, interleave your washi between layers of damp newsprint, and put it in a plastic bag to just gently humidify the paper, and then use the damp sheets out of that damp pack. Lots of papers print beautifully without doing that. And particularly, I would suggest not dampening Mitsumada fiber papers or Gampi papers because they have this strong tendency to shrink a lot when they're drying again. All paper expands when it gets wet and then shrinks a little bit when it dries, but Gampi does that with great enthusiasm and becomes quite wrinkly and buckly and is hard to control. I think it's important too, though, any paper, if you are printing on a dampened paper on a dampened piece of washi, if you possibly can, to dry it under restraint. So put it between blotters and change the blotters and keep it weighted so that it dries flat and smooth, because otherwise it will want to cockle a little bit.
Thank you so much, Sigrid.
Okay, and I think this is close to my last slide here. This is, it's a life-size jacket by Alexa Hatanaka called Motai Nai. And what's really wonderful about this is that she is of Japanese heritage. But what she's done is she's created this piece using leftover bits from other print projects that she's done, plus some paper that Causal papers, a variety of Causal papers, some that she's dyed with indigo, all of which she has treated with konnyaku starch. So you see this relief print around the collar and in the back, these indigo dyed papers here, and then she's sewn together other bits of plain papers, offcuts from things, and various offcuts of print, and made this whole beautiful series of jackets and clothing that she actually, if you take a look at her Instagram, you can see her modeling some of these things, and they're really quite beautiful pieces. So that's Alexa Hatanaka. And here I wanted to end off with this quotation by American textile artist Sheila Hicks. I actually have this quote stuck to my monitor at work, and I've got it over my table at home when I'm working. And I think it's, a lot of people will find out when they start working with Japanese paper that things don't always work out at the very beginning. It's because they're not familiar with the process. And Brian Kelly always likes to say that using washi is a little bit like getting to know a new friend. Sometimes you have to concede things to the friend and learn how to work with them. Now, part of this quote is actually hidden for me, but I will see if I can read it. At the beginning, you work with materials, you don't know them very well, and you try to get them to do what you think you want them to do. As time goes on, you understand the way to make them do what they want to do, but your way. And I think that stands very strongly for working with washi. There are a lot of things that you can do with it. It might not be what you used to, but if you give it a chance and try to use those different qualities, that it'll give a lot to you. It'll give a lot to your work. And we'll finish here just with a nice close-up of some beautiful Oguni snow-bleached paper. And I think that's it. I don't know if there's any other questions or...
Thank you very much, Sigrid. That really was interesting, and we're having thank yous come up in the chat as well. I think there's a question here about the thickness of the paper, essentially. And the question is, will the thin papers be okay for carborundum prints or other collagraph methods?
I think so. I don't know about carborundum prints. I mean, I'm not a printmaker, but I would say yes. Collagraph, yes. If the paper is 100% Causal fiber. Causal is the strongest of all of the fibers, that even a very thin paper can be quite strong. You might not get quite as much in a collagraph, for example. Part of what you're getting is the impression of the collagraph in the paper itself. Because the papers are thin, you might not get quite as much indentation into it because there's not as much fiber to press into, but it will withstand it. For sure it will. If you're using an inexpensive paper that isn't either very thick or hasn't got very much Causal in it, you might see some tearing because the fibers are not as long if it's got wood pulp in it.
Okay. There was a Mokahanga question here. Bear with me, I have to scroll back a little bit. This person says, I do Mokahanga and I often have a problem with wrinkling paper on the margins if they leave wider margins. Do you have any suggestions for that? I like it myself. It just tells me that part of the paper, but I know a lot of people would rather keep it smooth. What would you suggest?
If at all possible, and I don't know how you're drying it when it's wrinkling like that, is to dry it under restraint. I know that's hard to do when you've got wet ink on it. So it needs to dry to a certain degree, but then between blotters, in order for it to dry, pressed so that it's all hopefully drying at the same rate, and then changing your blotting papers periodically and then pressing it.
Okay. And there's, sorry, I'm getting questions and thank yous all muddled. So just bear with me, sorry. Inkjet printing on unsized papers, applying konjac in a spray bottle to help their ink. Will applying konnyaku help the ink to bleed less. And I'll just say something about using an inkjet printer on unsized paper, because that's something that I do. Is on your printer, you can turn down the amount of ink that's coming through by setting it to draft. And that makes a huge difference. You don't end up flooding your paper as much. Maybe Sigrid, you can speak to the application of Konyaku.
Yep, absolutely. Konyaku acts as a sizing on paper, and really good to use with inkjet printing. Yeah, you could, mostly when you're purchasing Konyaku, and we sell the starch in the powder form, and through our resellers, and it's basically you're mixing it with water and brushing on this wet solution of starch onto your sheet of paper. The instructions tell you to crumple the paper, but that's only if you want to make three-dimensional objects out of it and make something more cloth-like. So you can brush the starch on and allow your paper to dry, and then use that dried paper with the starch on it to print on, and it acts as a sizing. Most sizings applied to paper are some kind of a starch. So yes, that will work. And I think being able to modulate the amount of ink that goes onto the paper will make a bit of a difference. I mean, these papers are used by a lot of people for doing inkjet printing, but they're not developed for that. So you have to experiment a little for what works for you. Another thing to think about and just keep in mind is, if you are printing on a fairly thin paper, is to possibly send your thin paper through your printer with another sheet in behind it, just newsprint or something like that, to catch any ink that might actually go through, absorb through the paper, just to keep your printer clean.
Okay. Oh, and Sigrid, what was the name of the artist who did the encaustic piece?
That was Milton Jewell, Jewell.
Jewell. I'm just putting it into the the chat so people can see it.
Milton Jewell. I've seen a lot of really wonderful encaustic monoprint out there where people are painting onto a hot plate and then putting their paper on, and then just on the hot plate the encaustic soaks up into the paper. But what he's doing is a different kind of transfer process. It's like a two-step thing. So he's painting on a solid panel and then picking up bits of it. So he actually will sometimes choose not to heat one area as much as another in order to get little bits. It's very difficult. I once took a workshop with him and I got rather blotchy results. So it takes a little bit of working on it, but it's a very useful technique. He couldn't use any other paper to do that because he couldn't see the amount. If he was using a heavy Western paper, he wouldn't be able to see what of the wax and pigment is coming up into his paper because the paper is so opaque.
Sigrid, maybe we could give a little shout out to our resellers, because we have some people asking where they can purchase the Heritage Washi pack. I know that they are available from us, but importantly, we are a wholesale distributor. So would you like to mention that?
Yep. I'm going to now just go to stop share here. It's a lovely piece of paper, but I hope it's me that's showing. I see you, Paula, but we have these lovely packages called the Heritage Washi pack. This was made available in conjunction with this talk for anybody who wanted it. It's also available to our resellers. So we have resellers throughout North America in particular, but also in Europe and in various places. If you go to our website, we have a page on our website that lists resellers by region. If you're not sure where to go, email us and we will try to help you find the reseller who's best able to help you depending on where you are and what kind of paper you're looking for. So not all of our resellers carry everything.
Do you know what Kona fabric is? Someone's asking me if that's what my scarf is made out of. No, I'm going to have to say no. I don't know what Kona fabric is, but I suspect my scarf is not that. Do you know?
Me? No.
Yeah.
No idea. Okay. I think it might be rayon.
Let's see, I'm just many formal with printing on. Okay. Nancy is saying, many former problems you may have had with printing on washi could be solved if you use a better heritage quality washi. For example, the wrinkling of the edges that someone mentioned earlier with their mokahanga, and also that you'll get greater absorption and brighter color. So that is a good point. There's a number of people asking about where there are resellers. We do have a reseller page on our website, but I would also just email us and we can send you a list of resellers in your area, because there's questions coming from all over, and I think I can't keep up. So please email Washi. I'll type it into the chat, but email washi@japanesepaperplace.com, and we'll be able to address those more specific questions for your area. And here's a question for you, Sigrid. What would be the lightest weight paper suitable for relief printmaking? Her example is 16 gram, 32 gram.
Lots of variables here. You could actually, we have paper that is 5 gram Tengajo tissue. It's a machine-made one that you could use for relief print, but the thinner it gets, the trickier it is. I would say for ease of printing, you don't really want to go much thinner than 10 gram. You'd want to print that with a backing sheet. Also, you need to be very careful how much ink is on your block. A lighter amount of ink will help you be able to pull your print off of the block, your paper off of the block more readily. Also, if you have too much ink, it can go right through the fiber and overwhelm the paper itself. So you have to tone that, it's not the right word, modulate the amount of ink that you're using depending on how thin the paper is. You know, if you've got a thin paper, you want a thin amount of ink.
Yeah, and just to add to that point, I did a number of hand printed lino on a paper called, Sigrid, Muranami, is that correct?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Muranami, and that there is almost less fiber than air on that paper. It's a very airy, open fiber paper, and it was amazing what I could do with that. I was even able to print on it, stretch it between 2 small sticks and mount it. So it really, the Causal fiber paper is so remarkably strong that you hardly need anything there to print on, and you can do it. Yep. It handles differently than Western paper, and it takes a little bit of trial and error, but it's worth it. Totally worth it. Yeah. Now, a couple of people asking if the presentation will be available, and yes, it will be. We will be making it publicly accessible at a later date. Just follow us on Instagram and Facebook, and we'll announce it at that time. We don't know when that will be quite yet, so you'll just have to hang in there and keep an eye out for it. Other people asking if we'll do this again, and I hope so. Yes, we'd love to share more of our knowledge and love of paper with you. The paper I mentioned was Muranami. I'll enter it into the chat. Sigrid, there's questions about colored heritage paper.
Colored heritage paper. We have some beautiful color papers here that are natural dye. The Mitsumada iron oxide papers are really beautiful. They are 100% Japanese Mitsumada fiber colored with iron oxide pigment. Beautiful pink and gray paper, don't fade. We have some other natural dye that are made with plant dyes, a little susceptible to fading, but beautiful to work with. We have other color paper that we wouldn't technically consider to be Heritage Washi called Moriki Kozo because they're using synthetic dyes, and there's a little bit of wood pulp added to make it a heavier paper. But they are what I would consider a paper that would get an honorable mention with respect to being Heritage Washi, because they have a very high percentage of Kozo, are good, strong handmade papers and good light, fast colors. So we have a lot of that available too.
Okay, I have a question, sort of a question concern here. Rowan says, I have heard paper making in Japan is under threat as there are fewer makers. Is that right?
Yes, that is right. I remember when I started working at the Japanese paper place many years ago, there were over 300 and some paper makers, and I think Nancy might be able to say more accurately how many active paper makers there are today. I think it's probably more in the realm of 100 or something like that. So yeah, it is under threat because of that, but almost of greater concern would be the ability to get the fiber. Gampi fiber, for example, grows only in the wild, is harder and harder to come by. Climate change is changing how it grows and where it's available. There has also been a resurgence of interest in paper making. There are people who are realizing that life in the big city isn't really necessarily the way to go, and maybe living somewhere rural and making something that means something is pretty special. I think it's steady at this point, the way it goes, and there's still a huge variety, but it's changing. It is changing.
Okay, we're just about out of time. We have 4 minutes left. I don't know if there's any last quick questions, but really, I think what I would like to do is, on behalf of Sigrid and myself, thank you all so much for joining us. This is our first live Print Day in May presentation, and we're really honored that you joined us, and grateful for all your kind words in the chat section. All your thank yous means a lot to us. We do hope you found the presentation informative and that you feel inspired and ready to go out and start printing on washi. Thank you, Sigrid. Thank you, everyone, and happy printing.